Cool. So this is our very first ECD Conversations series, and today we've got James Roberts with us. I'm Lotty Roberts. Most of you may know me. If not, I'm a master consultant and elephant rider with the Emotional Culture Deck. I've got James Roberts with me today, who is going to introduce himself in a moment around what he does. He's the Chief Digital Officer for Wellington City Council. The surname isn't a coincidence. He is actually my husband, but he is also someone I've been working with on an ongoing journey with the Emotional Culture Deck. We thought it would be an excellent first guest for this conversation series to talk about the impact that looking at emotions in the workplace and working with the deck has had on his leadership and his team. So welcome, James.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I was going to say nice to meet you, but obviously I've met you many times already. I'd love it if you could just tell people listening a little bit around your role, what you do, like who you serve, who you look after, and your team, and a little bit about how you got into that. So I'll leave you to meander around those questions.
Sure. Thanks, Lottie. So I work at Wellington City Council. I've been there for about 4 years, and it's the first job that I've had that has been in the public sector. So the majority of, you can probably tell I'm not 21. The majority of my career, decades of it, in fact, I've been working in private sector organisations, mainly around technology and mainly around banking, telecommunications, and basically technology sales. And software development. So that's kind of my background. And I got to a point, I think a few years ago, I was very much involved in a number of kind of transformational projects at some of those organizations. And I kind of started thinking about where to from here. And I guess I sat back and thought, I'd like to do something that is providing some benefit and value back to the community that I live in, while also getting paid. And so thinking about a job in the public service or local government suddenly started coming into my head. And certainly it was an area I hadn't had much experience, or none actually. So it was kind of like a new area to learn. And so I managed to get a role in Wellington City Council, working on a transformation program, which then turned into a full-time role, in essence, as Chief Digital Officer on the executive team. And I have a team of just under 150 people, and we obviously do digital ICT, but we also have the customer service channels, which is a little bit different, a little bit unusual for a digital team. And the idea there really is really focusing technology on how to improve the customer experience, and that's really for me where it gets into how I can actually have an impact on the community by improving the experiences that people have when they're dealing with council.
Great. And so what has prompted you to start working? It'd be really good to kind of find out a bit about what prompted you to start working with the Emotional Culture Deck and what that's looked like over the time that we've been using it. So what prompted you to explore emotions at work? I mean, it's not something that is automatically people look at, particularly if they're in the role of a Chief Digital Officer. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that and the journey that you've been on so far.
Sure. Well, I guess my interest probably started quite a long time ago, way back in the 90s, when I did an MBA at Victoria University, and I can remember in the organisational behaviour courses and also the strategy courses on that, this focus on the human in the workplace, and the move away from that kind of old school Frederick scientific management method, which was somewhat dehumanizing, and a move much more towards a much more human-centric workplace and workplace culture. And there was a lot of, I guess, management thinking emerging around the time about how we could achieve that. So that's kind of like what originally tweaked my interest. I then actually had I worked with a couple of buddies. We did a startup software company, which ended up being quite successful and grew. And it was an opportunity to kind of try doing things differently from what I'd experienced myself in the workplace. And so it was a great opportunity to start bringing some of those ideas in. And so I guess I had a background from then of seeing how that different, human-centered, human-oriented thinking and culture focus could have a real impact on a business and people, and how they enjoyed working in a business. And while there is a vaguely kind of capitalist outcome from that, and that you do get, increased productivity, etc., it's really about seeing people having a smile on their face and enjoying their work and wanting to be there, and that then I think flowing through, to what they do outside of work as well, and how they relate to people outside of work. So for me, that's a really important value. And when I started getting an understanding of the emotional culture deck, I saw that as a really interesting, very powerful, very simple, very adaptable and accessible method of influencing culture to be very human-centric.
And so, so when did you start? I mean, I know some of this, but for people listening, they don't. But when did you start working with the emotional culture deck and sort of bringing more of an emphasis on, emotions at work? What does that look like, over the time? So just be good to kind of share a little bit about your journey so far and how you've worked with it.
Sure. So I think I mentioned earlier on that when I first started at council 4 years ago, I was involved in a transformation program. My experience with transformation programs is mixed, as in, how often they actually achieve what they aspire to achieve, because they're so complex and there's so many different moving parts. And in essence, I don't think that we were at council at the time, we were on track to achieve what we aspired to from that program. So we really had to kind of stop and re-gear and rethink. And as part of that, we did some organizational change as well. And that's when I kind of moved into the role that I'm in now, managing that large group of people. And so what happened really was a whole bunch of disparate functions came together and needed to operate in quite a different and transformed way. And so as part of that, it was almost like kind of stripping down a little bit of the old and recreating a new environment and way of working and culture that we wanted to operate. At the same time, and kind of in parallel with that, my current boss, Barbara McKerrow, who's the CEO, moved into her role, and she had a very strong focus on improving the culture and the performance of the organization and making it a great place to work as well. So I got a lot of autonomy and guidance in an autonomous way, and support from Barbara to really work hard on the culture, and also from Meredith Blackler, who's our Director of People and Culture as well, to really work on the culture. And they gave me a lot of space to try a lot of different things. And I knew that that yourself, Lottie, had come across the emotional culture deck. We talked about it, and as I said before, it just seemed like a very simple and effective but yet powerful way of influencing culture. And so I think it was towards the end of 2019, in November 2019, we did the first set of facilitated sessions with what was all the people leaders who work for me, of which there was approximately 20 plus. Right. And we did that, and we got some really good stuff from that. I mean, I think everyone who participated in that got a lot of benefit out of it. If nothing else, it cemented the fact that that was important. The human-centric place was important for us, and that we felt that building the culture was an important thing to do, and we wanted to emphasize that as a priority. And it kind of got everyone on the page there, which was really good. And then there were some actual direct benefits that came from it as well. So one of the things that in those workshops that we identified as an action was kind of lifting the amount of recognition that we are doing for people, and that being relatively simple recognition. So not necessarily recognition that's like big and over the top and grandiose, which I've experienced before in sales organizations, but just the small everyday, feedbacks and positive words and affirmations and all the rest of it that we often think but don't say to each other. And so in essence, what we did is we created a channel on Teams. And so anyone could go in there at any time, and all of my group is in that Teams channel, and you can post any comments anytime about anyone that you want to. We called it the praise channel. And that is used, and has been ever since then, really, being used regularly And it does make a difference. And the other great thing about using a kind of internal social media channel like that is that people can go on there and can show their appreciation by a raised thumb or a hand clap or a heart or those kind of things. So you get regularly, daily, multiple postings on there, and then loads of people will just pile on with the hearts and the thumbs up and stuff. So it's just a great, simple way of making people feel appreciated, and it's worked really well. And we're still doing it. What is it? 3 years later, it's still really popular.
Over and above, like you say, the formal way that we often recognise, because it just makes it so easy to do it as a day-to-day practice, which it should be anyway. just saying thanks, or really, people feel really seen when appreciation is expressed. So that was 2.5 years ago. And more recently, and what's happened since then, since those initial workshops that we did?
So we've in the group that I've got and across council, we've done a huge amount of work over the last couple of years, and as a result of that, there's been quite a bit of change as well. So I think I mentioned that the initial team of people leaders that we had go through the emotional culture workshops was about 20 plus. A good 14 or 15 of those people have moved on into either other roles in council or moved elsewhere. And we've got so over that period of time, we've got quite a different group of leaders now in the team. And as part of that, the change involved in doing that, there was again a desire to emphasize on the culture and making sure we got the culture right, really as a foundation for everything else. And to bring some new people and some new managers into the way that we work and the way that we do things. And I guess the other thing that I had noted and we've talked about is how important it is to embed these things in just your way of working, your day in, day out way of working. Because I'm sure we've all been on all sorts of brilliant interventions around organizational development and leadership programs and all those kind of things, which have been absolutely wonderful when you go away and you do a 2-day or whatever, and you come back and you go like, we're going to totally change everything. And then you kind of hit with everything that's going on, etc. And it just kind of pales away, unfortunately. And it's a shame. And so to stop that happening, you've got to actually make it part of your operating rhythm, the things that you do, the kind of as you, I think, called them, the rituals, the habits that you've got that are just part of the way that you work. And so that was another, desire that we had as a team, was like, we really want to raise, we want to refresh ourselves on the emotional culture. We want to bring on board those managers and leaders who hadn't experienced it, and also all our team members as well that hadn't necessarily experienced it. We see it as a really important and useful tool, and we want to embed it into the way that we work, into our operating methods as well. So that's why we've kind of revisited it over this last quarter.
I mean, that kind of a little bit of what you mentioned there prompts like the next question I was going to ask is like, what have you found in terms of the challenges of getting people to express emotions at work and work with the deck? You mentioned a little bit about embedding, and I couldn't agree more. And I think that's been something that I've really learned as a consultant and facilitator of this work, is I almost forgot some of the change experience about making change stick. And it's just the same when you come in and do these workshops. It's like people they're going to be excited for using it and being in the room, but when you go back, what happens? So what have been the big challenges that you've faced, just generally getting people to express emotions, getting them to work with the deck, or anything related to that?
So I think there's an initial uncomfortableness with some people bringing up the subject of, we're going to talk about how we feel.
Which makes sense, right? It's so counterintuitive. It shouldn't be, but it is.
Probably particularly my generation, right? There's an uncomfortableness. There's maybe an element of distrust. And I think that's really important as well, because I think it goes hand in hand with trust, right? Like being able to speak and talk about our feelings and how that can actually influence a positive growth trajectory on your culture goes hand in hand with building trust. I think you've got to have both, right?
Psychological safety as that foundation for the trust as well.
Yeah, exactly. So there's some, some of the new folks, etc., a little bit weary. Some of the things that people have said to me when they've come into, I don't think it's just particularly my team, I think it's council in general, is they're quite surprised at the work culture at council, and surprised as in surprised delighted, like it's better than they thought it was going to be. Because it is something that Barbara, Meredith, and myself, etc., and all the other executive team have really focused on. But yeah, there's an element of new people coming in. They're like, oh, I'm still kind of getting used to this. I'm not 100% sure. There's that little bit of like, oh, I don't generally talk about feelings. But the great thing about the ECD, because it's so simple and it's kind of slightly gamifying, you quickly hook people in because it's so easy to use. And the weirdest thing is you go, okay, pick a card. Okay, so tell me about it. Why did you pick that one? And suddenly people are talking, and then they don't realize they're talking about their feelings, which is stuff they wouldn't normally have talked about, right? And so suddenly you break through those silly little barriers of feeling uncomfortable or whatever, and you're having the conversations, and then it just kind of goes from there and strengthens from there.
So what have you noticed? I'm really keen to hear what you see about what you've noticed in terms of using it for yourself. Like, what have you noticed about yourself? And then what have you noticed in your team? Because again, coming back to that expectations in workshops, we like instant results, don't we? And we like them to be something really tangible that we can hold in our hands. But the interesting thing about culture is it is more of an experience. It is about how you feel. So what have you noticed in terms of yourself working with emotions at work and also your team?
Sure. So what I'll say has definitely been influenced by working with the emotional culture deck, etc. But there's probably also a little bit of influence from the kind of broader mindfulness activities that I've done that you've helped with and kind of spearheaded. But what I find is that identifying the feeling and then translating that into what that means in terms of behavior. So I'm feeling this, therefore I'm behaving that way, and seeing those linkages more clearly and thinking about those things more clearly. Yeah, exactly.
And what is the emotion telling me? Why is it here?
Yes, exactly. And then also recognizing, because you're recognizing the behaviors that are in essence being triggered by these feelings, you start to think about you start to kind of abstract yourself from the behaviors, see what the behavior is doing and how it's affecting you and other people. And if I go into a meeting room and I'm feeling a bit angry or frustrated about something, I know that my behaviors will show that, and people won't know that that's just something that's happened to me elsewhere. They'll think it's to do with them, right? And so by kind of doing this work, I've started to see these things more clearly and the impacts that they have. And then through, especially with some of the mindfulness stuff, being able to kind of manage that a bit more carefully. And therefore, kind of like, it's not being in control of your feelings so much. It's more like understanding where they're coming from, understanding how to manage them, and particularly when you're working with other people, how to do that with other people so that you're not causing kind of friction, etc.
And in your teams, what have you noticed? Like, it's been really great to hear. I know I've heard some of the stories of some of the ways that they're using it and what they're noticing. But what are you noticing in the people that you're working with, in the leaders that work for you and their teams, and just the general atmosphere and culture around the place?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're having conversations about emotional culture, which we never would have had. I mean, we just literally would never, even if you say, hey, everyone read this HBR article about emotional culture, like you'd never actually get to that point, right? So the fact that people are, involved in these workshops, with you, that they're responding to that, they're taking it away, they're thinking about it, and then they're actually putting it into some of their everyday practices, means that first and foremost, it becomes part of the conversation that we're having, which is a real change from where things were before. And especially with people who, would come across as quite introverted, maybe quite technical, hearing those people get engaged in it is really, I mean, it's like almost seeing a different person sometimes when you see them or have a conversation with them, because they're talking in a different way than they have before and you ever would have expected them to.
Maybe they're just talking.
Yeah, well, maybe, right? You know, most likely, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's because people can see that when you actually use the deck and you have these discussions and you apply it to different situations, how powerful it can be. So I've told you about a few of the examples. We've had the person who manages our service centre, the public kind of help desk, where people come in. We had some real problems in that area a couple of years ago, or kind of 18 months ago. And we've got a new leader in there, and it's really completely turned around. And she has very much taken on board the emotional culture deck and a lot of the coaching and facilitating and messages that you provided us, Lottie. And you can see very clearly coming through in the latest staff opinion survey, you know, a huge difference in the morale and general, I guess, happiness of the people working there now, 18 months ago. It's completely turned around. You know, another team member is, you know, doing project reviews, etc. Normally you wouldn't necessarily think of, oh, I'll grab the, you know, the ECD and use it for my project review. Is doing that and saying to the team, you know, when you started this project, how are you feeling? And now how are you feeling? And uncovering some of that stuff that inevitably happens in many projects. And, you know, like I was saying before about transformation projects, they kind of start off like this, and then they but that's a challenge in many projects. You get to that hard stage, it's not quite working out as you think, you know, a little bit of friction with people, etc. But being able to go to people, okay, so how are you feeling now, V? How you were feeling on day one when you're all optimistic and energized, etc. And then, okay, what's making you feel that way now? And how do we kind of unpack that? What is it telling us? What do we need to do? How do we need to turn things around? And being able to actually have that discussion as a group of people working on the project is quite different than a normal kind of project review or project status meeting or something like that. So, you know, some really powerful examples starting to come through of how we're benefiting.
And it sounds like a benefit that I can hear coming through in just the stories that you're telling is like a certain amount of resilience as well. You know, because how many times have people been sent on resilience training? But again, it's like actually sometimes doing something indirectly, that self-awareness, that being able to notice the emotions, both the unpleasant ones and the pleasant ones, seems like it's had an impact on resilience. Because like you say, projects, they don't go exactly as planned, no matter how good a project manager or program director or whatever you've got on the case, or how brilliant the team is. It's very rare that they go exactly to plan. So it does bring up a lot. Yeah,
absolutely, it does. Yeah. So yeah, super helpful. We've also had, I mean, people using it probably in the way that you've suggested. And you know, I think thinking back to how you and I have also talked about using the deck, and we did kind of trial it out as a to help us kind of establish a working partnership between, you know, my organization and a third party that we use to provide service to us.
Yeah.
And, you know, like that, this is the great thing, the kind of the applicability of the emotional culture deck and how it can be used in so many different situations. So, you know, thinking about how do we kind of move to a new level of contracting, third parties, how do we get things beyond everyone pouring over the contract and beating each other up over SLAs? How do we create an initial foundation of trust, etc.? Let's use the emotional culture deck in that initial meeting. And you know, I think that's a superb idea, and I think there's a lot of mileage in that. You know, I think that's probably even a whole other direction of business that you could take the ECD. And I think also the way that, you know, we've obviously got a lot of customer-facing teams. The way we've been able to use it for getting customer-centric, you know, because the words are easy. Oh, yeah, but we're customer-centric. But actually, what you've got to do is you've got to feel like the customer feels as you walk through the experience. And it is hard if you're if you're working in the experience as a staff member to get your head into the customer space. So the ECD, you know, is a way of doing that. And then I think, you know, we talked about stakeholders, the stakeholder relationships, not vendors, but stakeholders, and, you know, stakeholders that are supportive, not supportive, the ones you need to, you know, it's all those kind of things, and how you can kind of demystify that and come up with some kind of pragmatic approaches to how you might improve those relationships as well. So there's just so many interesting uses of the pack, eh?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And actually, I'd almost forgotten about the work that we did on the partnership stuff. And so for people listening, we kind of had noticed that when it comes to like these big, you're signing up big vendors and contractors, we quite often don't look at emotions. So we'd actually facilitated, how do you want to feel as a vendor or a consultant? How do you want to feel, in this relationship as the the customer? So it was quite really cool how that unfolded, because it was a bit of an experiment. And so that's what I've loved, is that you and your team have been so open to experimenting, and from that they've become more creative with it. And because there are so many ways to cut and dice this and bring it to any situation, because any situation people are feeling something, because we're not robots. So it doesn't matter what the situation is, there's going to be an emotional undertone there always. So I'd love to ask you a little bit more about, we talked about challenges, but specifically obstacles. What are the biggest obstacles in terms of moving to your desired culture? So, we looked at 5 emotions that you want to feel across your wider team to support your emotional culture, and then 5 ways you don't want to feel. What has been the biggest obstacle, you think, in terms of moving towards those desired emotions and away from those undesired emotions?
Yeah, so great question, because it's a hard one, right? Where it's all wonderful in theory, and you can see a lot of positive little things going on around you that makes you feel, oh, good, this is really working. But to get to the point where you can turn around and say, at the end of the quarter or the end of the period that your operating rhythm is working around, we no longer feel overwhelmed, disconnected, disheartened, reactive, and powerless. We now feel supported, connected, inspired, and empathetic and appreciated. There's quite a lot of work to achieve there, right?
It is. Simple but not easy. Sounds simple, but doesn't mean it's easy.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. So I guess the number one thing is like I said up front, the work gets in the way. Your BAU stuff gets in the way. People get busy, they get priorities, things happen. In our business, it could be anything from a particular service has to change because of a council decision, or God forbid a cyber attack or something like that happens, and people have to scramble and make things happen all of a sudden, and that means that people park all some of those other important things so they can get that done. So kind of managing the workload has been and it's been highlighted as something that does really impact how people are feeling, especially when they're feeling overwhelmed. A lot of that is about workload. And of course, over the last 2 years, with everything we've experienced around COVID-19, has clearly put a lot of additional pressure. Has put pressure on our business and council, because we've had to continue running the city and do things in the city to try and help the general population, etc. And that's everything from city safety, community assistance, emergency management, transportation, so many different things that we've had to do, which have been above and beyond the normal duties, I guess. But then also our staff themselves experiencing what it's been like living through the pandemic and the impact on their whānau and relationships and families and school and all the rest of it, and dealing with all that, dealing with the whole change to flexible working that we had to make, and then recover, and it goes back again, it goes forward again, and goes back again. It's been a cycle of, I guess, a stressful experience for a lot of people. So that plus workload are two of the things that are hard to they generally slow you down, I think. And so I think the key thing is taking it period by period, bake it into your operating rhythm, and understand what those obstacles are. Be pragmatic about what you think you can achieve over the next period, over the next quarter, or whatever it is that you're working to. And then really try and keep that stuff prioritized and keep space for it. But making the space has been the biggest challenge, I'd say.
And I think that's because the way we've approached it is we've done it as a journey, but I check in every 2 weeks. There's an hour session with the leaders where we kind of, we'll revisit a different aspect of the deck. So that's why how we've like to different customer, from stakeholders, from change, but also it's kind of that keeping momentum going. But what I'm noticing over the course of that journey, because I see it so many places I work, it's like, this is great, but I'm just so busy. I just don't have the time to do this now. I see that's important, but I'm just so busy. We've moved from that to we're just so busy, which is why we need to do this, because they see that they're so overwhelmed, and overwhelmed comes up all the time. And I know it was one of your top 5 undesired as well, is that can lead to a state of just not doing all of the things that help you to manage the overwhelm. So I think the benefit of checking in and doing this over time is they're starting to see that we don't do this when we've got space. We do this because we don't have space. It becomes even more important. And I'm loving seeing that realization just bubble up in people. That's what I'm definitely seeing in your team, but others as well. It's can be a slow burn. It starts with a small seed and just starts to grow.
Yeah, that's dead right. And when you're facing, I think, people feeling overwhelmed, and a lot of that is to do with workload, and a lot of it is driven by the environment we're working in, etc., and what's been happening in the last couple of years. You kind of feel that you have to address the big drivers of that. And while that is important, it can also be impossible. And so you do actually need to look at all the other ways that you are working. And we've talked about the amount of meetings that people have, and the amount of email that people get, and getting copied on things, the amount of, which I find a classic, the amount of consultation. Collaboration is a wonderful thing, but it can also drive a lot of extra work as well.
Yeah.
And so knowing how to edit collaboration such that you're not just permanently meeting with people and talking about things. So there are actually pragmatic steps you can take within our power to create space. But it's a matter of changing habits, and a matter of challenging some of the basic beliefs people have. Yeah.
And it's the fact that they keep coming up. I think, like initially you go, like, I see the themes very clearly, and you will have as well as the leader of like, there's just so many emails, there's so many meetings, I'm not getting any space to just do some focus work. And so then you'll maybe put something to them that's like, well, why don't we have a no meetings morning, or why don't we, different ways of working, and that things like, we've even talked about multitasking as well. And the first time people hear that, you can see the visceral response. It's like, oh, they've got that white knuckle grip on the way that they've been working, even though it's hurting them, And so initially there's just trying to prize that white knuckle grip is just impossible. But over time, when the same things come up over and over again, and I know like another thing that came up was like, because people really want to feel supported, and we said, what's the best way we can support people as leaders is having those regular one-on-ones, which were often deprioritized. But then it happens over and over again. You start to go, I have to make this a priority now. It might be uncomfortable, but I can't not do it anymore, because otherwise it's like Groundhog Day for your own suffering, really.
Absolutely.
What you think about that in terms of what you've noticed, and with it coming up so often?
Yeah, no, I mean it is, and look, I'm not the world's greatest role model on this one, but as I'm sure the people who report to me would say, but the one-on-ones, it was very interesting when we did do the most recent facilitation with the team on the emotional culture deck, and the kind of the actions that we could take. And I think it was the top one actually that came up, was the regularity of consistency of one-on-ones. And I know also from our internal opinion surveys that we do have a bit of a challenge in getting our management across the whole organization to prioritize actually having those regular conversations one-on-one with their team. And it is, and like I say, I'm not necessarily the world's greatest role model, because you do get, so-and-so needs this, so we've got an executive meeting suddenly on this, and it clashes with a one-on-one. So you go, wow, it's an executive meeting, I'll move the one-on-one. But it's people notice, right? And the problem is that you then never catch up on it as well, because you go, okay, well, I'm doing fortnightlies. I've missed the one this week. We could book it for next week, but we're going to do the one straight after, the week after that anyway. So we may as well just leave it to the next one. And then you suddenly realize you've, and I guess the other thing is that I'm also guilty of is going one-on-ones 30 minutes, right? And regularly getting to the end of one-on-ones now and finding we've run out of time. And so all we've really done is talk about the job and not about anything else,
Yeah.
Very
good observation.
Yeah, and so one thing I have tried to do, again, kind of triggered by this work through the emotional culture deck, is basically carve out 90 minutes a week, 60 to 90 minutes a week, in 3 30-minute slots, and basically say to the entire team of nearly 150, if you want to come and have a chat about anything, I've got 3 slots available, 2 or 3 slots available every week. So just get in contact and we'll book you in, and then I just go off and I think I've done about 10 or 11 of these since I introduced it about a month or so ago. And just anyone in the team, we just go and have a chat, either virtually or actually in a coffee bar, and talk about whatever they want to talk about, and just get to know each other a bit better. And it's all about kind of building trust and listening and hearing the other person and getting to know them a bit better, which really, again, is all about human interaction and feelings and emotions and those kind of things. So that seems to be working pretty well as well.
Yeah. I've got one last question for you. What would you say to other workplaces or leaders to encourage them to start to explore emotions at work and use the emotional culture deck?
Well, I would definitely advocate using it, most certainly. I think, as I mentioned earlier on, there are a lot of different kind of organizational behavior and management development and leadership methodologies and practices and things that you can do, and we've all done loads and loads of them. But this one is it's incredibly effective and powerful in the change it can influence, and it's so easy to use and so accessible. And because of that kind of little bit of gamification around the card deck, etc., people are very open to it. So I think it has to be one of the first choices, I reckon, if you're thinking about culture development. How do we better develop the people, the working environment, make it a great place to work, etc. For me, it would be, probably top of the list in terms of techniques to use. So I definitely encourage anyone to use it, and more than happy to speak to anyone as well if they want to come and have a chat about our experiences. More than happy to.
Great. Anything else you want to add before we close out this conversation?
The deck's brilliant and very, very important and super clever and powerful. The facilitation is also critically important as well. Because I've said before, I remember when I did a leadership program. I did a leadership program at when I first started at council, and they said to me, look, you've probably done this kind of stuff before, so you don't necessarily have to go on it. And I went on it, and it was really, really good. And the two key things were, one was the people that I was with and the conversation we had, and the second was the facilitator, a lady called Kate Peterson, who ran that. So you've got to have I think you've got to have the two things. You've got to have a great person who is leading, coaching, facilitating you through it, and you've got to have and the deck and the techniques itself. And I think those couple together. And then I guess for me the third really key thing is not just doing it as a one-off, but doing it over a series of engagements that enables you to really bake it into your operating rhythm, so it just becomes a normal way of working.
Yeah. And what's been great is I love the fact that there are people within your organization that are really taking to this with such passion that can become that facilitator for you as their knowledge gets more deep. And so, that cultivating of an in-house person is, the people that are ultra keen, they're your champions, really. And I love that there are people that are really doing that and exploring it. Well, thanks so much for your time today. Maybe I got one of those 3 half-an-hour slots, I don't know, but even though it's a little bit longer. And I'm sure that this conversation will add a lot of value to other leaders and workplaces watching it. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Ka pai.